I was asked to speak largely off the cuff about the practical value of stories, the practical value of a humanities degree, the practical value of the things we make and the things we read. And I'm excited to talk to you about that because I've had a zany life career and I work in all sorts of public areas, even though I am a professor at Ohio State. So just a few examples, I work with trauma nurses, I work with third graders, I work in Hollywood, I work with a lot of very big CEOs, I work in Silicon Valley on AI, and most weirdly and bizarrely, I work with United States Army Special Operations. And a number of people have already expressed extreme concern that I might be trying to brainwash or psyops you, and I assure you that is completely true. I've been sent here to mind control all of you. And I tell you that because I get brought into all these organizations, none of whom are interested in any of the writers I like. So my favorite writers, if some of you have been unfortunate enough to listen to me on podcasts, you'll know my favorite writers are Maya Angelou, Virginia Woolf, writers like that. So I like kind of like weird experimental 20th century writers, particularly writing from the margin and things like that. And I can assure you none of the places that I work with are particularly interested or enthusiastic about those specific works. But I can tell you that they're fascinated by the insights that I bring to those organizations. And they have convinced themselves that those insights come from me and not from Virginia Woolf or Maya Angelou. But of course, the reality is otherwise. So what I'm gonna talk a little bit today about is some of my work in terms of the power of stories, how I think that power is currently being deeply underappreciated in our world and in our schools. And then at the end, after I've talked about some of my sort of like nerdy research, I would be more than happy to talk about my work in Hollywood. I've worked a ton, Netflix, Amazon. I have worked with Disney, although I've cleared my conscience because I've gone on a series of podcasts and talked about how Disney is evil. I've worked there. If any of you are interested possibly in becoming a special operator or joining the CIA, of course, I have all the paperwork. I'd be happy to share that with you, talk to you about that. If any of you are seriously, thinking to yourself, I might actually have to go work in this thing called business. If you want me to talk a little bit about that, because one of the things that stories are so powerful at is not just communication, because we're always told that stories are just about communication. Stories are about making a plan. They're about seeing new futures. They're about strategy. They're about invention. They're about innovation. They're all these kinds of things. And I can just tell you that American business right now is largely run by a cult of what is called management. And management is basically just like pushing numbers around and trying to get people to act like widgets. And really what people want, what we all want, is someone who has a vision. Someone who can tell a story of the future that's new and exciting that we can get behind. Same thing in politics. So I'll talk a little bit about my research because you're going to be forced to indulge me because I'm a professor. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my research to start. But then at the end, feel free to ask me anything. Ask me personal questions. Ask me about my career. Literally ask me, how could I get an internship? Any question like that is practical, we can talk about today. So to start with, my credentials, as you've heard, are I'm a member of Ohio State's Project Narrative, which probably none of you have heard about, but we are known as the world's leading academic think tank for the study of stories. So we study all stories, we study what they do, and my specialty, my background is ultimately in neuroscience. And so I'm very, very interested in kind of how stories work in the brain. And in particular, I have just been fascinated ever since I was a child. Some of you may have been children. And when you were a child, you might have read a story. And you will have noticed a couple extraordinary things happening in your brain. When you read that story, the first extraordinary thing you'll notice is how it was working on your emotions. And some of that emotional work was just kind of hedonic gratification, kind of fun and whatnot. But some of it was more profound. It was helping you process hard things. It was helping stimulate and inspire you and give you courage, things like that. So stories are just enormously powerful at that emotional piece. And then, of course, the other thing is your imagination. I mean, this is why so many of us get into stories as a child, is we read a book and we get so excited after the first couple pages, we have to put the book down and then just keep imagining what goes on. And then we pick it up and we read some more and then we go on. And as a child, you can read a book that's not even that wonderful a book, but it can fire your imagination so profoundly you can live in it for days. And that's often thought by the adult world as being very unserious. But everything cool in this world that does not come from nature comes from imagination. Anything that you like in this world, in this room, on this college, somebody imagined it. It wasn't there before. And that's that same part of the brain that's being fired in us when we read books. I just wanted to know, where does that come from? And so I loved books as a child. When I got older, I didn't really like my literature classes that much. And so it took me a long time to actually go on and actually get my PhD in literature. I sort of did a detour in neuroscience and then came back to do the literature stuff. And now I sort of focus on that combination of the brain and stories. And so two big pieces of the emotional part are health and well-being. And the reason I break those apart is because we talk an enormous amount about mental health nowadays, and I think rightly so. But a lot of times when we talk about mental well-being, we kind of fold it into mental health. And they're two different things. Mental health is processing, working through negative experiences, things that are hard for us, hard feelings, hard emotions, hard times. And mental well-being is going beyond a state of neutral. It's going beyond just being mindful, and having joy and love and all these positive experiences. And literature, of course, can do both for us. And so I became fascinated in this. And of course, the reason I got invited here is because I wrote this book, which I think they're giving away some copies of at the back. And it uses this very simple strategy. I won't walk you through all the steps of it because it's a bit tedious. But basically, what I believe is that there are no universal stories. And I believe that great writers are inventors. So what that then leads me to believe is to say that every book on our shelf is special in some way. It has a special effect on our brain. And so I start by trying to find the unique effect of a work of literature. I say, what's it doing? And a lot of times I just kind of ask people who like the book. It's a very unscientific way of doing it, but I just ask people. And then once I've got an idea, then I force them into brain scanners, which is much more scientific. And then we get the kind of hard answer. And then once we found the unique effect, we trace it back to a unique technique. What's something new that they're doing in terms of the way that they're using story that's causing that brain pop? And we usually trace it back to a unique character, plot, story world, or narrator. So that's just the method. If that interests you, I could talk about that all day, but hopefully it's pretty simple and straightforward. And so I'm going to walk through a couple of the inventions I talk about in the book so you don't have to read it. So first, in terms of processing grief. We all experience grief, and most of our oldest works of literature focus on grief, going all the way back thousands of years. And grief is the story at the heart of Greek tragedy, which most of us have been told at some point or another is the greatest and most significant achievement of Western civilization. And what did Greek tragedy give us in terms of dealing with grief? It gave us something known as the revenge plot. And basically what happens in the revenge plot is something bad happens to a character, and so they make some other character feel that pain. You took my eye, I will take your eye. And so this famously is the story of the Oresteia, if you've read the Oresteia, and many other Greek tragedies focus on this. And so what I became interested in is this turns out this has a kind of minor cathartic effect when people watch Greek tragedies. But it turns out what has an even more cathartic effect is when they watch a play called Hamlet. And what's different between Hamlet and Greek tragedy? It's a very simple thing, which is that the plot, the revenge plot, is delayed. I noticed this when I was about your age and I was forced to read Hamlet, and I found it incredibly boring. I was like, nothing happens in this play. This person just keeps talking the entire time. What's going on? And it's so long. Hamlet really is a very long play. It's much longer than most other contemporary plays. I should also say, please don't repeat these thoughts in front of your literature professors, because when I say them in front of my faculty, they get very grumpy with me when I start talking about Hamlet being very long, but it is very long. And the reason it's long is because the plot is delayed. The play begins with a classic revenge story. A ghost comes back and tells his son, revenge me, revenge me. And then we have 4 hours of the son being like, what kind of revenge should I do? And is revenge really right? And what happens when I die? And what happens in all of those moments is it stimulates something in our brain to be really annoying called autobiographical recall. And what it means is that as Hamlet is thinking, we're starting to think. And our mind is starting to wander and we're starting to drift. And what's happening in that moment is we're prompted to focus on grief And then instead of moving into action, we're moved into reflection. This technique hadn't been used in literature before, but I'm sure many of you will have had the experience of reading a memoir of grief at some point and having it help you process that grief. Maybe someone goes through a traumatic experience or a loss and they write about it, and you'll notice that not a lot probably happens in that memoir. There's a lot of not much happening. And because what that's allowing you to do is process. It's a very simple technique, and we know that it was tremendously effective. People came back again and again and again to help them process their own grief. Very simple. It's an example of a kind of technique. Okay, 2 types of trauma. I'm going to talk about this because even though I had all this advanced scientific training before I wrote the book, I thought there was only one type of PTSD. I had no idea that there were 2. There's probably more than 2. But I had no idea that clinically speaking, at least, there are 2. And they're very different. The first type of PTSD is what we associate with a sudden, single traumatic event. So a soldier in combat. And what happens with that type of PTSD is runaway, uncontrollable emotions and flashbacks. So there are moments when you're doing nothing dangerous or scary, and all of a sudden you have this flashback and you can't stop the emotions, you can't sleep. That's the most kind of commonly known type, and it's also the most common type of PTSD. It's about 2/3. The other type of PTSD is common among survivors of chronic trauma. So if the same thing is happening to you over and over and over again, if you're in a domestic abuse situation, we have to keep going back to that environment over and over and over again. What happens in your brain in that case is the opposite of uncontrollable emotions. What happens is your brain starts to view emotion as dangerous, and it starts to become numb and dissociate. You undergo things known as depersonalization and derealization. And in terms of your brain, this means there's an almost opposite mechanism happening. So to make the brain a little bit simpler than it is, the kind of core, the most ancient core of our brain is that emotion center. And then the front of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, you could think of it as a kind of brake that's tapping down on those emotions and saying, too much, too much. So in the first type of PTSD, what's happening is that brake goes off because the shock is so intense, it blows the brake out. And so your deep emotional brain is just kind of running unchecked. The second kind, where you're numb and dissociated, you can imagine what happens. The brake is too strong. The brake comes on and it stops you from feeling anything because it has started to feel all feelings are dangerous because it's opening me up to be dangerous, to be hurt. So why did I tell you that? Well, because long before I or any modern clinician realized that there are 2 types of PTSD, writers realized it and developed therapies. The first example I'll give you, this is for the first type of PTSD. This comes from Greek tragedy, Oedipus. Have any of you read Oedipus? I don't want to spoil the ending, but something bad happens. What's interesting about Oedipus is when I read it in high school, I was told, oh, there's like ironic foreshadowing, and you're always kind of told all this kind of stuff, and so on and so forth. Actually, that's not important. It's true that you know the fate of the character before them, but the reason that you know the fate of the character before them is so that you can process what happens to them before they process it. And what that means is that in your brain, you have survived that shock when they have not. So what happens in Oedipus is you, as he experiences the trauma at the end of the play, can reach out to him and say, I've been there before. And if you remember, at the end of the play, Oedipus actually turns to the audience and says, help me. And you can say, I can help you because I knew this was coming and I mentally prepared for it. And so I'm in a position to help you. And we know the number one thing you can do if you have type 1 PTSD is to help others. The more you help others, the more it builds what's called your self-efficacy, your belief in yourself. And the more you believe that, the more you heal yourself as you heal others. And so this play gives you an opportunity to go through that process. And we know that this play, and in general, I've worked with a lot of veterans, a lot of military veterans, this play, other Greek tragedies, it's tremendously therapeutic for them. The second kind remember the opposite kind of PTSD. Have you read Alice and Bechdel, Fun Home? If you haven't, I've just ruined the ending for you. This is the ending. What happens is it's a sad, tragic story, which ends with a surprise twist, where we feel gratitude towards a character who we thought was causing harm, and we feel joy in what we thought was going to be a very sad moment. And the reason this is so powerful is that if you are suffering from the second type of PTSD, you've shut down your emotions. But if you can be surprised into positive emotion, then all of a sudden your brain's like, oh, emotion isn't bad all the time. Maybe I should feel more. And so Alison Bechdel uses this technique. Other writers you have perhaps read will use this technique, where they'll talk about a tragedy or grief, and then suddenly they'll pivot into a strongly positive emotion. And it will surprise you and make you feel less dissociated. And in general, the same thing, if you are experiencing type 2 PTSD, the goal is to put yourself in a position where you can slowly start to experience more positive feelings. So those are two simple ones. So those are mental health benefits. I'm going to walk through some well-being benefits. The simplest and most basic is just wonder. This, we believe, is the very first thing to be invented by writers. It comes from something known as the stretch. It just means to take something gold and make it golder, or to take someone brave and make her braver. So anytime you read a story and someone is themselves but only more, or a sky is itself but only more, this happens almost all the time in your favorite literature. And it creates this sense of awe in your brain, which interestingly leads to a kind of deactivation of your sense of self. You feel one with the world. So if you've ever felt that feeling of being so amazed that you've forgotten yourself when you're reading a book, and we know that that leads to what's called a self-transcendent experience, which is another way of saying a spiritual experience. Whether you believe in the existence of a higher power or not, your brain can have these spiritual experiences. And what's interesting about them is they not only lead to intense positive affect, so you're more joyful and happy in your life, they lead to increased generosity because you're less conscious of yourself. And this is one of the most basic and fundamental effects of reading. Almost any work of literature has some moment of wonder in it where you're like, wow, that was fantastic. Love. It's a pretty cool thing. We maybe don't get enough of it in our lives, but we get lots of it from literature. Tons of it from literature. In fact, we get so much of it from literature, you might say, oh, no one invented that. It's always been there. No, it was invented by Sappho. Sappho did this extraordinary thing, which she's the first writer we know of to make what we would call a personal disclosure. And a personal disclosure is to confess something that is dangerous to confess. To say something in public that could lead to judgment or some other kind of public harm. And you see what's happening in this poem is she's confessing this love that she has, but she's also confessing a love she has for another woman who's in a relationship with a man. So you can see how this is a very kind of dangerous thing to confess. And in all the history, going all the way back, even when you read Homer, in Homer, characters only confess things that we already know that they should feel. So women will always confess, oh, I miss my child or something like that. They confess things that fit their social roles. They're not dangerous. This is a dangerous confession. What's even more amazing about Sappho is she doesn't just make first-person dangerous confessions. I was talking about Homer. This is how Sappho rewrites the entire Iliad. And it contains a dangerous confession in it. Can anyone see the dangerous confession? What would be dangerous to confess? Here, I'll show you. Forgetting her child. What mother would forget her child? I certainly hope no one in this room would do that. That would be disgraceful, right? But when we get that confession, we feel suddenly close to Helen in a way we never do in the entire Iliad. We suddenly understand the nature of her love. We understand how different it was. We understand how dangerous it was. And almost all the love stories that you like to read will involve some kind of confession like this, something that can't be admitted. Somebody had to invent that, and that was Sappho. Okay, one last one on these ones, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about imagination, and then I'll wrap. Courage. Courage is one of the most powerful effects of literature. When you read a book and you just feel braver. You read a book and you feel like you can change the world, you can do something hard, you can do something difficult. That had to be invented. We can give Homer credit for this one. It comes from something, it's a narrative trick. In the book, I call it the almighty voice. Basically what it means is you write like a large human. And the original third-person narratives, if you read Genesis, are very booming and very objective, and they don't have any feeling or sentiment in them. But then you get the Greek gods, and the Greek gods are very human. And it's the same thing with Homer's narrator, is he writes with the human heart only in a third-person voice. So it feels like the human is everywhere. A modern version of this is Charles Dickens, for those of you who recognize it. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. You see how it was, this is very objective, but like, who thinks it was the best of times? Who thinks it was the worst of times, right? Obviously humans, because that's illogical. Something can't be the best of times and the worst of times at the same time, right? God would be fired from heaven for thinking such a logical contradiction, but humans can think that. This is the same effect that you get when you sing in a choir, because your voice becomes part of a bigger voice. If you have no friends like me, you can just sing in the shower. And you know how when you sing in the shower, it echoes and reverberates and it makes you feel bigger than you are. Your voice is loud and you feel brave, like you can sing anything. Oh, I've got such a great voice. Taylor Swift's going to invite me on stage tomorrow. It's going to be amazing. Okay, so those are all the health and well-being effects. I'd be happy to talk more about them if you want. But I want to talk about something that's become a kind of more personal object of study for me for just the last 5 minutes or so as I'm chatting here. And this is the power of literature to inspire creativity, to inspire imagination. And I got moved to join this research field because for 30 years, we have known that the longer you remain in school, the less creative you get. We've known this for 30 years. It's probably been going on for longer than that, but we've known, and no one has changed it. That means that when you're in 6th grade, you're less creative than you were when you were a kindergartner. When you graduate high school, you're less creative than you were in 6th grade. Now, you guys are less creative than you were in high school. I'm by far the least creative person in this room, possibly, because I've had tons of education. But, you know, why has no one stopped this? I presented this once, actually, this slide at a conference, and this person raised his hand. He's like, well, don't you think we just all get less creative as we age? And I was like, no. No, I mean, it's not natural to get less creative. We want to get more creative. Why is school making us less creative? There's a million reasons why school is making us less creative. I could talk about all of them. But what's interesting is that we've shown that school can actually make you more creative. How? Spoiler alert, literature. So creativity, I always have to sell this part because a lot of times people think creativity is just making art. I get this a lot also when I go in school. It's like, well, what's the point of being creative? Just do finger painting. It's like, no. Are you aware that creativity is how you solve problems and build business? Oh, business, very good, business. Medicine, oh, okay, very good. The two ways that we've identified in my lab, these are kind of technical terms, I'll break them down for you. It does something called diversify your causal thinking and sharpen your counterfactual thinking. In terms of diversify your causal thinking, that just means it allows you to imagine yourself as different people who would solve the same problem in different ways. When you read a book in which the main character is different from you, you then have the opportunity to take that character and bring them with you. And then the next time you have a problem, think like that character. Children do this all the time. And as we get older, we get discouraged from doing this because we're taught in school to judge the characters in books. And instead of thinking, oh, you know, all these characters are good, but just different. We're like, no, this character is the only good character. So that's something that literature can do, and we help kids do this. Sharpen counterfactual thinking, what that means is, can you tell a story all the way to the end without any jumps in the story? Can you fill in every step of the plan, in other words? I don't know if any of you have ever had like an amazing idea for a screenplay, and then you get to like the middle of it, like, oh, I have no idea how to make these things happen, you know? You can figure out how to make them happen. Your brain has that power, but you have to work at it. And the great thing about literature is it's always helping us fill in those other steps. The more you read novels, and the more you're like, yes, I see that could happen. I can see that happen. It's helping you sharpen your counterfactual thinking. So I'm going to present a bunch of really boring data. I'll go through it really fast. The point of this is we ran training on third graders, which is the part where the creativity decline becomes. And we saw that they not only got more creative, but that their creativity was more useful. So they came up with creative answers that worked. And then we did this really mean thing, which is that when they gave us a creative answer, you would go, it didn't work. And it's scalping just like that. It didn't work, third grader. It failed. And when they had the training, they not only came up with second answers, their second answers were more creative than their initial answers because they knew how to use their imaginations. And so they tried harder. And so here's a bunch of more data on that. Here's some kind of examples of what happened before they got the training. So we would say to them, hey, think of someone your age you like to play with. Now you want to go with them to the pool, but they tell you your swimsuit looks dumb. And the ones who didn't read literature would be like, well, I'd tell them that their swimsuit looks dumb too. Or I'd go change to another swimsuit, right? These are, Whereas the more creative kids, you can see, I'd say you can look at one thing in two ways. So my swimsuit can be dumb, but also cool. My mind was blown when a kid came out with that. I was like, what, you're in third grade? So smart, we should make you president. And then, of course, I'd go have so much fun on the water slide that my friends would want to join me. You see how that's a perspective shifting thing? Because you're imagining yourself not just as yourself, but as your friends at the same time, because literature helps you be in two places at the same time. My favorite one of all was we had this student. It's not actual, full disclosure, this is not actually the student. We're not allowed to reveal the identities of the student. We had the student come in one day and she's like, I want to go to astronaut camp, but my parents won't let me. I was like, is there an astronaut camp? She's like, yeah, I'm sure there's an astronaut camp. And so we went through this whole imaginative game and we were like, why do you want to go to astronaut camp? She's like, well, because I want to float. We're like, does anything else float? Fish float. I could float like a fish if I was a scuba diver. I could be a scuba diver if I take swimming lessons. So this is her kind of creative problem solving using her imagination. And then she went up to her parents at the end of the day. She's like, I want to take swimming lessons. And they were like, fine. And she was like, yes, I won. And it's just a great example of how your imagination can help you solve everyday problems. And, to you or me, maybe this isn't such a big problem, but to a third grader, right, this is her whole life, this problem. So I want to end by thanking the people who made this research possible, including the people who have brainwashed me in special operations, but also the Army Nurse Corps, who I work with a lot on sensitive issues in terms of trauma and grief and helping people process grief and helping themselves process grief. This also comes from Worthington Schools, where we did that crazy mad scientist experiment, and the Center of Cognitive and Brain Sciences. And if you're interested, this stuff is all published. You can read it in the Journal of Creativity, New York Academy of Sciences, even Harvard Business Review. So, this is my last slide. I submit to you that even though people are always telling me that literature is useless, there are at least two useful things we can do. The first is go back to the enormous catalog that we have of stories and do just what I did for you today and just find out what is unique about each of these works. What unique powers does it have to help us heal, to help us realize our mental well-being, and then to imagine and create. And then, of course, for anyone out here who's more creative than me, make the next story. Give us the new invention that we don't know that we need. That's my talk. Thank you. And I'd be happy to answer questions about that or anything else. Yeah.
So in the poster that advertised this talk, it talked a little bit about how you drew from stories from other cultures to create your narrative. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so one of the things, people don't often realize that I'm from another culture, but I am. I'm from Scotland. And we're still very angry about Macbeth, I can tell you. One of the things that I believe is that stories are constantly evolving and are constantly different. And there's a myth that emerged at the end of the 19th century, which is now known as the hero's journey, which began in the work of someone called Fraser, who is actually a Scottish comparative mythologist. And he claimed that every story in the world was really just a retelling of the same story. And he did this based on his enormous knowledge of other cultures, which consisted of him sitting in his office and writing letters to various imperial officials and having them send back notes about what people in Africa and China were doing. And there came this idea that all cultures were telling the same story known as the monomyth. And this was then folded into various things like Jungianism and Freudianism and whatnot. It has become a kind of doctrine in Hollywood. It sort of is something that is often associated with Star Wars. And I mean, I just thought this was nuts. If you go to almost any other part of the world, you realize they have completely different ways of telling stories, that those stories are alive and evolving over generations, that even if you go back to ancient Greece, which is, of course, the most boring place of all, every myth is told many, many different ways in ancient Greece, and it evolves over generations. There are multiple versions of it. So stories are alive, they're different, they're constantly diversifying. And so a big part of what I like to do in my work is gather up different stories from different historical periods and cultures, and then bring them to Hollywood and say, why aren't you making these stories? You know, these are not monomyths. And they'll say, well, audiences aren't ready for this kind of story, or this story is really weird, or so on and so forth. So I then made a series for Amazon, which you can watch, in which I go through the 12 most successful movies in Hollywood history as picked by Hollywood, and show that none of them are hero's journeys either. And that in fact, every story that we like does something new and interesting. So my answer is broad, but hopefully it makes sense, which is that I like to go learn from other places and bring those stories back to Hollywood and say, you know, here's a story you haven't told yet. And you know, if you want to check the book out of the library, you'll see that most of the stories are not from America. They're from other parts of the world. Yeah.
This is something that this is the future. Like, these are good, but this one sticks out above.
No, because unfortunately, part of being a professor is you just don't have those kinds of strong opinions. You know what I mean? Like, oh, they're all so good. You know how like professors are. Like, we just want to have every book in the library. But I can tell you that there are so many fantastic, wonderful stories out there that are different. And I would imagine that most of you, I mean, one of the things that's been interesting about Hollywood over the last 5 to 8 years is a lot of new stuff has been made without as much oversight as in the past. And so hopefully some of you over the past few years will have discovered something and been like, I can't believe they made that. And then of course they'll cancel it immediately as soon as they discover it. But there's a lot of it out there. And my own sense is that we're living through an era where there has never been quite so much distrust of other people as there is right now. And the sense that we're constantly under threat from people that are somehow different from us. And that's so, I mean, not helpful, but also, I mean, that's not how our country, when our country has worked. And I say this as someone who's an immigrant who came to America. And so to a certain extent, when you're an immigrant, you become a citizen, you kind of drink the America Kool-Aid. So I apologize if I've drunk too much Kool-Aid. But I do think that America, when it has been its best self, has been inclusive and trusting of people who are different. So if I could tell one story, it would definitely be a story of trust. But I tell you, there's lots of stories out there. And there's probably stories in this room. And there's room for all of them in the world. I mean, you remember how many stories you read as a child. I don't know. There's definitely room for more. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I'd be very happy to talk about that. So the first thing I'll just say about all this kind of Hollywood stuff is most people who tell you their Hollywood story, it's very eccentric, and mine is the same way. And so a lot of times you're sort of looking for insight, kind of global insight. So I will tell you my story, but if I were to say two things that might actually be helpful, the first is that it generally comes down to being very clear and specific about the kind of work that you like and the kind of people you want to work with, and not quitting. So a lot of people struggle in Hollywood because they think, oh, what do people want me to do? Or what do they want me to be? And that's a very easy thing to get into in Hollywood because the entire culture is kind of that. And you'll just notice when you go through Hollywood that the people who are really successful in Hollywood have a very strong sense of the stories that they like, and they stick to them. And so I always really encourage people to do that and not get decentered. And sometimes it can really help. I mean, one of the real values of being in a place like this is it gives you the kind of clarity to think, this is what I really think is a story. And also maybe gives you a chance to build a little bit of a network in terms of other people who think the same way as you. And it can be very helpful to go out and have a couple people kind of on your team who can kind of support you. And then it really comes down to, can you just keep going? Because the system doesn't really care about you. It's a really cruel place. But eventually, and I can say this from personal experience, not just myself, but I've had many students who have been successful. And eventually at a certain point, your kind of different thing breaks through and then everyone thinks you're a genius, you know? And you have this sort of strange shift overnight where all of a sudden all these people who were kind of locking their doors are welcoming you in. And that itself can be a very alienating experience, believe me, because you're like, who can I trust? Who can I believe? But if you're strong in yourself, you can handle that. The second piece of advice I would just give straight off the bat is find an internship. And a lot of times when people look for internships, they go on the internet and they're like, oh, Disney's offering something or Marvel's offering something. That's not finding an internship. Finding an internship is identifying favorite quirky shows you have, going on IMDb Pro and looking up the kind of small production companies that were associated with them, and then calling them and being like, hey, you need an intern for the summer, don't you? And them being like, well, I'm not sure that we do. Yeah, you do, you know, and getting yourself that internship that's not on everybody else's radar. I run the internship program at Ohio State. The numbers, just to let you know, are that you probably need to apply to about 20 internships to get one. And I say that partly because that's a certain sign of your level of commitment to applying to an internship, because like, oh, I'm gonna do it. But also because that shows that you're pushing outside your first thoughts. And so much of being effective as a creative person in life is pushing outside your first thought, right? I mean, we all have that experience. Like we write the first thing on the page, we're like, oh, it's never good. And then eventually around thought 20, we're like, oh, maybe that can stay. It's the same thing with internships. You sort of have to push and get creative by knocking things out. And the students who I see at Ohio State who are less successful will just apply to 3 or 5 internships. So those are the 2 big pieces of advice I would have. In terms of my own path, which is just totally wacky, I started out in neuroscience. I was working in a physiology lab at a medical school studying how the brain worked. I was like, I don't think we understand enough about imagination and emotion. I'm going to go study literature, get my PhD to understand more about these things. Went and got my PhD, and then I got my first job was at Yale, where everybody thought I was, was at Stanford, where everyone thought I was a lunatic because I was going in there talking about neuroscience and stuff. And they basically were just like, go talk to the undergraduates and don't bother us. And so I was very alone at Stanford, and I was like, who can I talk to about the fact that I'm really so fascinated by stories and how they work? And Pixar was right across the bay. So I picked up the phone. I said, hey, Pixar, I'm a professor at Stanford, which is a very important university. And everyone here takes me very seriously. So would it be possible for me to come and just kind of watch what you guys do? And they're like, oh, you're a Stanford professor. Of course, come. And I went and formed a lot of connections and relationships there. I discovered they had like a secret vault in the basement where they had all the kind of like versions of Toy Story that they didn't actually show to the world because they weren't good enough. And I got to study those and learn from those. And so I sort of got in there really just as a student of story, not as someone who was interested in being a writer. But what I realized was really exceptional about Pixar during that period of their history, and which has since been demolished by the evil empire known as Disney, is that they were committed to telling unique idiosyncratic stories. So they just made Up. I mean, Up is one of the weirdest narrative stories. If you've ever watched Finding Nemo, one of the things that's fascinating about Finding Nemo is it has if you were to summarize the story, you would say it's fairly traditional, but there are long stretches in the middle where it just goes totally bonkers. And you're like, who's in charge of this story? Like, what's going on here? And they just had this commitment to idiosyncrasy, to being unique, to being different. And I was like, this is the answer. These movies are so good. Someone's got to go to Hollywood and tell people to make more idiosyncratic movies. And so then I went to Hollywood and told people to do that. And of course, I was ignored completely. But I started, writing to prove, because in Hollywood, they don't allow you to just consult on stuff. You have to prove that you can do something useful. So I wrote a script. It kind of drew people's attention. And then as a result of that, I got asked to work on a lot of other projects. And slowly over time, I became known as someone who didn't just use the same story formula, but could listen to the author or listen to the place where the story had come from and then use that story, that unique story, to create a unique kind of script. And so that kind of became the thing that I was known for. They're, not because they liked it, but because they're like, oh, no one else can fix this. So I became kind of known as the fixer because I wasn't just using the same tools as everyone else. And so that's kind of how that started. And so I've met a lot of famous people and worked on a lot of kind of like things. And 99% of the stuff that I've done has never gotten anywhere near being made because that's kind of the way that Hollywood works. But it has been fun. So I do recommend it to people if you like that kind of thing. Any other questions? Yeah.
You haven't talked about this, and it might not be something you do at all, but you use humor a lot. So I was wondering if you work on humor at all in your studies of how stories work.
So you might be my favorite person. No one else thinks I'm funny. I'm not kidding you. So in Hollywood, I was sort of lamenting this earlier. I would never get hired to work on a comedy. Never. I'm not Adam Sandler, who we all know is hilarious. I would never get hired to work on a sitcom. I'm only ever hired to work on dramas and sci-fi, which are very serious. So yeah, no, I mean, but humor is, of course, one of the most important parts. And humor is important in so many different ways. So I talked about love, and one of my favorite writers is Jane Austen. Why? Because Jane Austen allows you to have love, but also a sense of humor about it. And that's very healthy for your heart and for your brain. It actually activates different parts of the brain. They go active at the same time. We know that humor is one of the best analgesics or sort of pain meds that your brain has. And so when I work a lot with doctors or soldiers, they have these very developed senses of humor that allow them to kind of manage and kind of process events. And humor, I mean, there's you know, it's been said many times, but it is true. The more comedy you see in a society, the more likely you are to see women be free. This is a kind of famous remark that's been made over the ages many, many times. But the point there is essentially that with comedy comes a sense that you can laugh at power. I mean, one of the things that I try and do is I try and take myself not that seriously, which is hard for me because, you know, I'm a very important person. I'm not sure if you're aware of just how important I am. But I think I think, you know, when you're standing in front of a group of people, not taking yourself seriously is important. And I think that's kind of a cornerstone in general of any kind of democratic open community, is that everyone in it take what they're doing seriously, but not take themselves seriously. So that's another way in which I'm very invested in humor. But I'll be honest, humor is one of the kind of more magical, mysterious parts of writing. And I don't think I've done any more than scratch the surface of my own research. Yeah.
Opposite of background humor stream a lot going on. But how does it work
Yes, how does it work in business? Yeah. So I started talking about that a little bit. And if you want, I've written a whole series of articles for Harvard Business Review and whatnot that you can just Google Angus Fletcher and Harvard Business Review. It's very, very important stuff. So the true story of how this happened is I published Wonderworks, and right after I published it, I got this phone call from, let's say, a very big business school, since I'm on camera. And the very big business school called me in, and they said, Dr. Fletcher, we've read this book, and it's a wonderful book because it explains the secret formulas for various emotional effects. And I was like, oh, I suppose that's what it does. And like, we could use this very powerfully in marketing to convince people to buy any widget that we create for them. And I was like, no. I was like, that's not the point of the book. The point of the book is the story you tell yourself. It changes how you work, not that you should tell other people to control them. And you might imagine the business school was very disappointed in me when this happened. But they then came back and they said, well, we've got this kind of group that we call the entrepreneurs. And they're all supposed to be very creative. But the truth is that if you're going to business school to become an entrepreneur, I can almost guarantee you, you're not that creative. Why? Because why would you go to somebody else to teach you how to be creative, right? It's really not a famous business school. It was like when I was in Silicon Valley recently and everyone was talking about how innovative it was. And I was like, if it was innovative, it wouldn't be Silicon Valley, because this is the place, right, where everyone knows that you think you're innovative. Anyway, so table that. But they were like, okay, so can you train our entrepreneurs to become more creative? And I was like, well, I don't know. I was like, I have this chapter in the book where I talk about how children's literature, like Winnie the Pooh, makes people more creative. And they're like, we don't have any other ideas here at our important business school. Why don't you go try that? So I then got to spend all this time basically doing children's books with these entrepreneurs. And you know what? It worked. It worked. It was nuts. And that was actually when I got the call from the US Army. And the US Army was like, we're worried we're not creative enough. And I was like, other people have worried that too. And so they're like, can you come in? And so we did this training, which is the same thing. We do basically versions of children's literature exercises with members of the military. And they become kind of more adept at solving problems and whatnot. And so this became very exciting to the business community, because if you can work at important business schools training entrepreneurs, and you can also work with the US military, that's kind of like the kind of two tick the boxes. And so then I started getting asked if I could sort of, train people to be more creative in a practical sense. And so the things that I work on most of the time are, first of all, leadership as opposed to management. And so I say, managers are people who can keep the system running as it's already running, but leaders are the people who can see the new thing. Then I say, you're getting my full business training here. Then I say, we're all born to lead. It's very inspiring when you say this to business people. Why is this inspiring? Well, because it's actually true. You have to learn to be a manager, because no one was born to manage. When you go back to the origins of human history, there weren't like large sprawling organizations that required, one person to sit at the top and make sure that everyone was punching their time card. But there were very small groups of people who at any moment had to tap the individuals within them to try brave things to survive. And all of us are here because our ancestors were leaders. They took risks. And so a huge part of uncovering the leader in yourself is unprogramming your brain from everything that society has taught it to do, and instead accessing these things that we do naturally as children. And just a couple simple ones. The first is what I call spotting exceptional information. And the reason I call it exceptional information is because that's what the US military calls it. We could also just call it something weird or unusual or different. And this is something trained out of us in the adult world. When we see two things, we're always like, how are they the same? How are they similar? Or if we see something that's different, we dismiss it and say, well, it's wrong or it's useless. As opposed to saying, oh, it's different. How could that be good? Which is what your child brain does. So again and again and again, leaning into the exceptional and seeing it as something powerful. The other thing we talk about a lot is we call it planner, not the plan. And what I mean by that is so much of modern business is obsessed with coming up with the perfect plan. And if any of you have parents, they might have done this to you. Where they're like, what's your plan? Gotta come up with the plan. And the reality is no plan survives contact with reality. What you want to do is you want to train yourself to be a planner. Having a plan is not helpful, but being a planner is. How do you become a planner? You have to think through extreme scenarios, not probabilities. When you think through probabilities, you come up with the optimum plan. When you think, what is the wackiest thing that could possibly happen in this situation and what would I do? You're training the planner. Is that wacky thing going to happen? Maybe, maybe not, but something else wacky is going to happen, and then you're going to be prepared for it. And you're going to be able to move faster than other people. So those are the kind of two main things that we train in business. I'm not sure if that's helpful. And then, of course, business people are always very obsessed with communication because they believe that somehow if you can communicate better, then you can somehow program the people in your organization to do exactly what they're told. As if somehow the reason that people aren't doing it is because they don't understand. It's just because, right, they don't actually have confidence or care. And so really, actually, the other thing we talk about a lot with business people is how you get people to buy in. And how do you get them to buy in? Well, you actually have to learn who they are as a human. You have to learn what they care about, what motivates them, and then somehow, amazingly, you have to figure out how your company can give that to them so that they can give what they care about to your company. So that's kind of the kind of, you've just received $10,000 of business training. I hope you appreciate it. It's so valuable, so valuable. Yes, exactly. Any other questions? Yeah.
So I loved everything you've been saying about stories. It's honestly very inspirational, and also your work with like children and children's books. And I'm actually interested in being a school librarian. So I was wondering, kind of from that like background-based knowledge, do you have any
So the first thing is children will naturally find their way, and every child finds it there in her own time, and some children want to read more than others, but all children will find it there. I think the key thing as a librarian, I would say, is first of all, there's a lot of like really good old smart books like Beverly Cleary and whatnot that are these books that are just about ordinary life and about like ordinary problems. And kids in our studies have found those so helpful because they are helping them do that kind of real life role playing thing. The other thing is what really helps kids is not reading the right story. And when I go into schools now, people are so concerned about giving kids the right story. What's the story that teaches them morality? What's the story that teaches them the right thing? We've got to keep them away from the bad stories. There's actually these choose your own adventures that I discovered because I was looking for choose your own adventures with my kids, where anytime you make a bad choice, you die in it. And there are millions of these things have been sold, and all these children are learning that if you make a mistake, death, And so the main thing I would say is get a lot of different books and trust kids to find their own way. Obviously, there should be some guardrails. There's certain books we don't want to give to kids, but don't try and just give them books that you like or you think they should read. Allow them to explore, trust them to do things. My son went through this whole phase where he was just completely obsessed with the Confederate Army. And I was like, where did this come from? He's like 7 years old and he's like obsessed with, I can't even remember the names of these people, but there's like some cavalry guy who's like famous for like running around and getting shot in the arm and then dying heroically from his own side. And they built statues to him. Anyway, so my son, I'm like, oh my God, we can't, we got to like give him books about Ulysses S. Grant, who's on the other side, It's like, no, my son reads a bunch of these books and then he moves on to something else, And so I would just say as a librarian, just give them a diverse, inclusive library, encourage them to explore, and don't be scared, we've all read books in our life that were like, I don't agree with that. And it didn't harm us, We just were like, I don't agree with that. And then I move on to something else. So I hope that's helpful, but kids are super resilient. They're super curious. And as long as you give them the opportunity to grow, they will. Thank you. Well, thank you all for your time. I really appreciate it.